Hi, everyone. I think now is a good time to start. We have 63 people on the call working right now. Welcome to this event on urban innovation in Africa. My name is Emmanuel Adigwe. I'm the managing partner for Utopia in Lagos. I'm also leading Utopia's Africa's strategy. We're hosting this event in partnership with the Skoll World Forum or Skoll Foundation as part of the virtual Skoll World Forum Week. Just quickly take you through the agenda for today's event. We'll quickly run through some housekeeping and a few slides just to talk about Utopia and the work that we do. And then I'll have the privilege of introducing all of our panelists, who are amazing people, by the way. And then we go on to the actual panel session. Just for some insights into how the panel will run as well. It would be every one of the panelists will have the opportunity to give opening presentations, right, on specific topics that have been chosen. And then we will have the rest of the time to then go into conversations and discussions. And lastly, we would introduce the Lagos Urban Innovation Challenge. And yeah, that's it. Will be done in about 90 minutes. So looking forward to having fun with all of you. So just for some quick housekeeping, if you do have any questions during the panel or during the discussions, there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Just use that to ask your questions. We will look through and try to answer as many of those live questions as we can. We already have a lot of prepared questions for the panelists, but it will be a mix of those questions and the questions from the audience. So please use the Q&A button. Also, please feel free to take snapshots of yourself while joining this call. Take screenshots of the screen, and please post on social media using the hashtag Urban Innovation in Africa. Skoll goes virtual, and then tag our various handles, primarily Utopia Lagos. And we'll be sharing and posting this throughout the day. And also please note that this event is being recorded, and we will share the recording with participants after the call. So right now I'll hand over to our managing partner who's based in Kathmandu, Nepal, to quickly just share briefly about Utopia and the work that we do. There.
Thank you, Manuel. So as we are very well aware, we know that the urban center of the world is radically shifting. Out of the 100 biggest megacities in the world, by the end of the century, only 10 will be in North America and Europe, and 90 of them will be in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So a lot of these cities are straining under the weight of this rapid growth. And some of the very same cities don't yet have the dedicated urban innovation ecosystem and platform to really support this. And so what Utopia is really doing is helping to build out the platform and infrastructure for urban entrepreneurs to help transform their emerging cities and help take a bit of that weight off of the shoulders of government that have been kind of strapped for resources and resources in all ways. So we're doing this through creating a network of city labs across Africa, Asia, and Latin America to build this urban ecosystem. And these city labs are essentially urban venture studios that help build and back urban startups focused on making their cities better for the many and not the few. And they also help to connect to governments and to help innovate for their cities. So essentially we work with urban entrepreneurs and partners to rapidly envision, validate, and launch new urban solutions and startups. We do this as a company builder as well as an urban fund, bringing in the resources needed to seed and grow these urban enterprises. And so the city labs become the home for urban innovation in the cities that they operate in. We currently have teams in Lagos, Kathmandu, and Rio de Janeiro, and aim to establish many more in the network in the years to come. And our guiding question is always, will this make cities better for the many, not just the few? These are some of the urban innovations around the world that we draw some inspiration from. This is us, and this is Utopia.
Great, thank you for the quick introduction. If you want to learn more, please just go to our website, utopia.do, and always shoot us an email, hello@utopia.do. So very quickly, I'm going to introduce our panelists for today's event. Like I said earlier, we have really amazing folks on the call. First person I'd like to introduce is Edward Glaser, who is one of the world's leading urban economists and author of the best-selling book, Triumph of the City. He is the Fred and Eleanor Dulin Professor of Economics in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University, where he has taught since 1992. He teaches urban and social economics and microeconomic theory. Edward has dozens of publications in leading economic journals on many topics in the field of urban economics, including on cities, economic growth, and law and economics. In particular, his work has focused on the determinants of city growth and the role of cities as centers of idea transmission. He received his PhD from the University of Chicago in 1992. Next on our list of panelists is Astrid Haas. Astrid is an urban economist who has worked in government and non-governmental organizations across the various countries. She's currently the policy director of the International Growth Center based in Uganda, where she manages and carries out policy-based research on cities based on demand from the government. Her research specializes in urban economics, specifically in the areas of municipal finance, urban mobility, and land tenure. She holds an MA in international economics and international development from Johns Hopkins University, and a BSc in economics, politics, and international studies from the University of Warwick. In 2016, she was nominated by the University of Cape Town as one of Africa's young leaders. Next, I'd like to introduce Abosede Alimi, who has over 15 years experience working across the nonprofit, private, and public sectors as a development professional. She began her career in development with ActionAid International in Nigeria and has moved on to lead corporate social responsibility and sustainability for several companies in Nigeria and West Africa. She's currently the Director for Strategy, Funding, and Stakeholder Management at the Lagos State Employment Trust Fund, where she is responsible for coordinating the key enablers that aid the program implementation in the fulfillment of the fund's mandate to create jobs in Africa's largest city. She has a degree in political science, public administration from Udine University, and a master's degree in communication for innovation and development from the University of Reading. She's one of the pioneer team members and leaders at LSETF, who are leading an ecosystem approach to job creation in Africa's largest city, Lagos. Next, Miriam Raw. She's passionate about improving cities through technology and design. She's the program director at UrbanX, an accelerator built by Mini and Urban Us, dedicated to investing in and supporting entrepreneurs developing urban solutions. Previously, Miriam worked at MIT Sensible City Lab, a research laboratory dedicated to exploring the future of cities from a data and sensor-based technology perspective. Trained as an architect and urban planner, she also worked at the Office for Metropolitan Architecture in Rotterdam. Miriam holds degrees from Harvard University and Cornell University. She co-organized the first Harvard X Design conference in 2013. George Barr is an advocacy manager in the GSMA Mobile for Development Utilities program. His responsibilities include managing strategic partnerships, generating and disseminating insights and best practices for the mobile-enabled utilities ecosystem, and representing the team at a range of external events. Prior to joining GSMA, George gained experience in strategic communications, economic research, and government affairs. He also contributed to an European Investment Bank project on private sector development in fragile states. George holds a master's degree in international economic policy from Sciences Po in Paris, and a BA in economics from McGill University, and a certificate on development and planning African cities from UCL. His research interests include digital solutions for the urban poor and the political economy of infrastructure and utility service delivery. His recently published report, Digital Solutions for the Urban Poor, looks at how innovators across Africa and Asia are improving basic service provision in the context of rapid urbanization. And lastly, I'll be your moderator for today. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm the managing partner for Utopia Lagos, and I'm leading Utopia's emerging efforts across Africa. Previously, Emmanuel Adegbe designed and led Mandela's Entrepreneurship Center. He also managed programs and strategic initiatives in support of talent development for Africa's most talented software developers. He has several years of project and operations management experience. He's extremely passionate about innovation with a thorough knowledge of the African technology ecosystem, and he has a proven track record of designing and implementing programs that support entrepreneurs. He holds a bachelor's degree in engineering physics, postgraduate degrees in space applications and environmental management, and a certificate in discipline entrepreneurship from MIT. He's also a 2019 Skoll World Forum Fellow. With that said, I would like to then call on our very first panelist to give his opening presentation. Over to you, Ed.
Thank you, Emmanuel. I am really very pleased to be part of this. I can't think of anything that is more vital for the future of the world than urban innovation in Africa. And while we are at a moment of extraordinary challenge for our urban world, it is a moment in which we can still, I believe, see hope. I want to start with this slide, which is a picture of how the world has changed over 50 years. Each one of these bars represents the share of countries in each income bracket that is more than 1/3 urban. More than 1/3 urban is meant to capture a reasonably urban place. So what you can see at the far right hand is that both in 1960 and 2010, those countries with per capita incomes between $4,000 and $5,000, almost all of them, about 80%, were more than 1/3 urban in 1960, and 80% were more than 1/3 urban today. Of course, the dollars are corrected for inflation. 3,000 to 4,000, 100% were more than 1/3 urban in 1960, 80% more than 1/3 urban today. Basically, again, no change. But go to the far left side. Go to the poorest countries in the world. How many of those countries with per capita incomes below $1,000 were more than 1/3 urban in 1960? It's a very easy number to remember. The number is 0, not a 1. Because in 1960, as had been true throughout almost all of recorded history, to be poor was to be rural. To be rural was to be poor. Today, more than 40% of the world's poorest countries are more than 1/3 urban. You see a similar and dramatic shift in those countries with incomes between $1,000 and $2,000. In 1960, 1/5 of them were more than 1/3 urban. Today, 60%, triple. And we see the rise of megacities in places like Kinshasa and Karachi, in places that are both poor and poorly governed. Now, there are enormous challenges associated with urbanization, but there is, as I have said, also hope. Cities have enabled the collaborative chains of creativity that have generated humanity's greatest insights, greatest innovations for thousands of years, since Socrates and Plato bickered on an Athenian street corner. Miracles have been made in technology, in culture, in politics, in cities, and those miracles are still around us. When you look at those countries that are more than 50% urban, and those countries that are less than 50% urban, the more urban countries have on average income levels that are 5 times higher, and even more strikingly, infant mortality levels that are less than 1/3. This graph shows the relationship between urbanization in 1960 and per capita income growth between 1960 and 2010. And what you can see is the places that started with an urban edge experienced much faster urban growth over the next 50 years. This does not lead me to think that we want to artificially force urbanization, right? But I cannot look at this graph and think that the right answer is somehow or other to stop the growth of cities, as if you could ever do that. The right answer is to try and figure out how to take advantage of urban agglomerations, to take advantage of the fact that people become smarter by being surrounded by a maelstrom of smart people, to take advantage of the fact that in cities we make markets, we form connections over oceans and continents, we enable poor people to come and find some form of opportunity. You know, it's often said as if urban inequality is somehow or other something that cities should apologize for. But I don't think cities should ever apologize for their poverty. The reason why, as long as they're turning poor people into rich people, if cities are attracting poor people and then allowing them to move up an escalator of progress, they're doing exactly what cities are most vital. They're doing cities' most vital task. This graph shows the fact that cities are not just about incomes. This is the gap between urban and rural happiness across a series of countries in the world. The data is a little bit old, from the 2005 to 2009 period. The 0 line shows those countries where the people who live in rural areas say that they're about as happy as people who live in urban areas. So in rich countries, it's pretty much equal. The Swedes are happier when they live in cities. The Italians are happier when they live in rural areas, but it's basically a wash. But go to the poorest countries of the planet. So those are the countries on the far left: Rwanda, Moldova, Ghana, Mali, and India. These are places in which there's a striking urban-rural happiness gap, and it favors cities. There is just no future in rural poverty. And as difficult as it is to manage the downsides of density without money and with weak governance, right? It is vital that we actually try and make these cities more livable and more innovative rather than trying to somehow or other stop their growth. Last slide. But as the COVID-19 pandemic illustrates, there are also demons that come with density. If two people are close enough to exchange an idea face-to-face, they are also close enough to exchange a virus. And if someone is near enough to sell you a newspaper, they're near enough to rob you. Over the past 1,000 years, cities have been trying to deal with these contagious epidemics and congestion and high housing costs and crime, all of the demons of density. But the most terrible of them has always been contagious disease, and that is what we are fighting with now. In 1900, a boy born in New York City, or in 1600, a boy born in Shakespeare's London, could expect to live 6 years less than a boy born in the rural countryside, right? Today, life expectancies, until the rise of COVID-19 at least, have become substantially longer in the wealthy cities of the West. That didn't happen by accident. The wealthy cities of America were spending in 1900 as much money on clean water as the federal government, as the national government was spending on everything except for the post office and the army. It was about an enormous investment. And it was not just about infrastructure, it was also about incentives, right? You can see here in 1842, I don't know if you can see it, the dot is the Croton Aqueduct here. This was the huge piece of infrastructure that New York built. And you can see that for 25 years after that, New York continues to experience cholera epidemics. My great-great-great-great-grandfather died in the 1849 cholera epidemic there, 7 years after the Croton Aqueduct opened. The reason was the last mile problem in New York that still bedevils urban Africa today. The fact that you build the water main and poor people say it cost me $1,000 to connect and I only earn $2,000 a year, so thank you very much. That was exactly the same thing that was happening in New York in 1849 and 1854. And it was only after 1866, where you see here the Board of Health opens, where they started imposing regulations that forced tenement owners, that forced slumlords to actually connect to the water infrastructure, that New York started to become healthier. We are facing at this moment what seems like it was a once in a generation challenge to cities with the rise of COVID-19. It is something that is enormously difficult and poses a deep challenge for our entire connected urban world. But I remain convinced that if we work together, if we innovate, if we use the resources of both the public and private sector, our cities can be safe once more, whether they are rich or poor, and they continue to be the engines of innovation that they have been for millennia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eric. I've actually never heard anyone speak so powerfully about the need for cities, almost the inevitability of cities, especially in Africa. And I mean, it's just interesting to hear you say the thing that always interests me is how African cities right now are pretty much at that place where the US was in the early 1900s, if I'm right. And it's almost inevitable that a lot of the rapid development that American cities have seen since then would also happen in African cities. And thank you so much for that intro. Next I'll ask Astrid to give our opening remarks, to share a bit about what research is saying about the role policymakers can play in shaping urban Africa's future.
Great, thank you, Emmanuel. And thank you very much for the invitation. And I actually look forward to joining you from one of the fastest growing African cities, Kampala, Uganda. So building off Ed's remarks, urbanization is happening rapidly in Africa, and we want it to be an engine for growth. But it's not inevitable that it will be as we see today. And in particular, one big difference between sort of the African urbanization story and the urbanization story of many of the developed countries that have urbanized before us is that we're urbanizing in a low resource environment, which means that we're not urbanizing as we're industrializing, and we do not have the money to be able to do all the innovations and all the infrastructure investments that are needed. However, even though governments do not maybe have the purse strings to make the difference, governments do have the ability of policy making and of regulating. And so what I want to talk to you very briefly about today is what we see sort of coming out of the evidence as the regulatory potential that governments have to really foster innovation and therefore better management of African cities. So on this the first point I want to make is that it's not only about planning for the cities that we have now, it's about planning for the cities that are going to come, and they're going to come in the next 10 to 20 years. Africa is only about at 1/3 of its urbanization level, such that 2/3 of our cities are yet still to be built. However, the cities that we have now, so an example on the left from Kibera and Nairobi, show that we haven't really planned properly for people's settlements, and people have settled before we've been able to build the necessary infrastructure and manage the land. The challenge with this is that we find from evidence that it can be up to 3 times more expensive to try and put in the piped water and the sewage infrastructure that we need, particularly in days like this where we're facing a health crisis when people are already on the land. So, you know, in terms of policy choices and policy making choices, planning for the cities to come is really important. And it's not expensive. The image that you have here on the right is of Hargeisa in Somaliland. Somaliland is not a recognized country. Hargeisa is its capital, but because it's unrecognized, it doesn't receive large aid flows. In fact, its city's budget is about $8 million. Yet it has understood the value of trying to direct and manage urbanization. And all it does is create this grid structure and outline, which shows people that in the future, here will be roads, here will be infrastructure. We can't afford to put it in right now, but please leave us the space to do it when you settle. Oh, and by the way, here are the plots that you can buy to do that will be next to it. The next slide makes the point that we need to ensure that regulation is fit for purpose. And this is particularly acute in the housing sector. We have a deficit of affordable housing across our African cities. The deficit is so large and only growing that no government would be able to afford to provide all the public housing that is going to be needed both now and that will be needed in the future. However, a major challenge of the housing sector is due to outdated regulations that make construction costs very high. In fact, across many African cities, the regulations still stem from colonial times and are therefore not fit for purpose for what we see now. The response to this is what we see sort of on the left is the informal settlements and the shacks. But although these places are then affordable, they're not livable and defy all sorts of health and safety regulations. One, you know, there's a lot of sort of regulatory changes that could be made here. One that I would just want to highlight in the context of this conversation about sort of enabling innovation is that people are innovating within already the regulatory space. Although that shack may be not fit for purpose for living, someone has created it and someone has rented it out and someone is living in it, right? So how do we enable these people who've understood what affordability means to actually just ensure that they can build housing, sorry, just go back to the previous slide, that can build housing that is fit for purpose, and that is to regulate to allow for incremental, one potential is to regulate to allow for incremental housing, which is make sure that you have the basics in place, the foundations, the walls, the roof, but then allow people and have it in legislation that people can build as they go along. The example here is actually from Chile. On the next slide is about ensuring that policy is an enabler to support what people are already doing, but to make it do them help them do it better. And here particularly I want to call out the transport sector. On the left is a picture from my own city. On a normal non-COVID day, we currently have a full lockdown, so that picture would be very different. But on a normal day, this is our main form of transport, 14-seater vehicles. Now, anyone living or who has been to an African city know that this is not a sustainable form of providing transportation for a growing city, not least because of congestion and the air pollution problems. However, all of these matatu drivers have found a need in a space that is currently not being filled, which is transportation, and have found a way to provide it at a low cost. And so how do we enable them to be able to both regulate their current transportation so it meets better standards? How do we regulate them to decrease the supply? But how do we also enable them to access finance so that they can come together and start investing in bigger buses? They know what the demand is, they know what the supply is, they're already providing the transport. And also this provides a number of jobs for people across the city. So how do we incorporate them as we move forward to more mass transport systems? And my final slide just highlights that we are, the major benefit that African cities have is that although we're urbanizing in a resource poor environment, we're actually urbanizing, unlike our European and US counterparts, in a data-rich environment. So I won't talk to this anymore because I know George is on the call and he will speak to this more. But this is just some, if you go back to the previous slide, just a picture of Kampala's congestion just taken from mobile phone data. And we are currently urbanizing quicker than we have the ability to analyze, or to collect surveys and administrative data. So how do we pull on new forms of data to be able to help inform the decisions that we need to make, and therefore understand where we can use our minimal resources to support innovation across the urban sector? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Astrid. One of the things that I find interesting about the work that we do in the urban innovation space is governance is critical. And I don't shy away from that. I go into meetings with government folks and I'm like, hey, we need you guys because there's no way you're going to be able to support entrepreneurs without, one policy decision can literally wipe out the entire business model, right? So the next presentation we're going to hear is from Abosede Alimi, who actually runs a government program that's designed to support job creation within Africa's largest city. Welcome, Abosede.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Great to be here. Thank you for having me. So I think the first place to start would be to talk a little bit about Lagos and give some context for those of us who might not be aware. So Lagos is Africa's largest city by population, and that population today is about 21 million people. The last set of data that we have, because I can tell you that this has significantly changed, says that 85 people arrive Lagos every hour to make it their home. And so there's an annual population growth rate of about 3 to 5%. Of course, it is Nigeria's commercial capital, the largest urban area, but the smallest land area. And that's very interesting. It is home to 20% of the MSMEs in Nigeria. And of course, it has a huge unemployment rate, even deeper when you go into youth unemployment. And so as a city, the government is dealing with, as you can imagine, a lot of issues. And so if we go to the next slide, it sort of shares with us the development agenda that's informing all the work that government is doing. So they've sort of come up with an acronym called THEMES. And this is along some of the things that I think Astrid was speaking to. So traffic management and transportation. If you've ever been to Lagos, you've experienced that. But again, with the lockdown, I'm sure everywhere will be calmer. Health and environment, again, very critical. And I mean, even more so now with what's going on. Education and technology, making Lagos a 21st century economy, city, and within that lies sort of a lot of things. And I guess when I start to talk about the work that we do, some of that will come to the fore. Entertainment and tourism, that's something that Lagos thrives on from a revenue point of view, but just from an experiential point of view as well. And of course, the last piece is around security and governance. So in looking at all of this, one of the most critical things is job creation, because then you have this huge population, most of whom are young people, whom are very restless. And I mean, jobs is a critical part of ensuring that the city functions. And so the government set up an employment trust fund with a very clear mandate to create jobs. And so this slide that you see is what the problem is, and it then starts to show you how we're doing this. So we're delivering across a few sort of key areas. The first one is access to finance. So when you start to look at small businesses, as we know, especially here in Africa, one of the major challenges is access to finance. And there are two things when you talk about access. It's the real accessibility of it, but also the affordability of it. And so with what we do at the Employment Trust Fund, it's about providing access. And so it's easy for people to actually apply for our loans. The barriers are very minimal, but also affordability. So our loans come at 5% per annum. And depending on how much you're getting, so you can get, in terms of dollars, you can get a maximum of $12,000. So we also deal in sort of the micro, small, and medium enterprise space. And these are over 12 to 36 month durations. When it comes to jobs, another critical part is skills. And so we have an employability program that sort of started from industry. So sort of mapping out Lagos and some of the things that are unique to Lagos. Tourism is huge, hospitality, healthcare, construction. And so identifying those high growth areas that create jobs, healthcare. And so what we've done is we've identified specific skills that are always lacking in these sectors, and we are upskilling young people to actually take up those available jobs. Innovation, I think that Lagos is the natural sort of innovation capital of Africa, but the truth is they kind of did it on their own, and as government, it was very clear that if we were going to be playing a role, we had to be playing a supportive role. So we have a set of programs under Lagos Innovates that supports the technology startup ecosystem, as well as innovation-driven enterprises. And we're supporting them with some of the critical things around infrastructure, so data, giving them workspace vouchers. We're supporting the hubs as well, so kind of taking care of the supply and demand side of things. We're providing access to finance for the hubs, again, at 5%, which is very affordable. And also the last piece of that is we're also providing digital skills, because what you find is a lot of the young people who have the skills are quickly exported. And so these small startups who are trying to build their businesses, especially in Lagos, don't have that pipeline of skills. And so we're intervening in all those areas. With market stimulation, what we've been able to do is actually look inwards and with partners to say, how do we facilitate sort of like the development of all the market conditions? So how do we create the enabling environment? How do we facilitate ease of doing business, right, for these businesses? And so with that, is just trying to say, what can we do to catalyze even more jobs without sort of intervening directly? And then of course the final piece around leverage. A lot of these businesses, and 70% of our businesses actually say they have never received any form of sort of training or business support service prior to being beneficiaries of ours. And it just tells you that just beyond access to finance, there's also the capacity and the business development support that these businesses need to actually survive and be able to create jobs at the scale that we want them to create jobs. So I think that, yeah, I think it's okay to stop here. I'm sure that as we go into the questions, I'll be able to share more.
Nice. Thank you so much, Bose. So quickly, I'll move over to Miriam, whose job is directly in supporting urban entrepreneurs through UrbanX, although in a different region. It'll be interesting to hear your perspective on what the opportunity is for entrepreneurs and investors in the urban space in the first place. Is this sector actually worth investing in? Happy to hear your thoughts.
Great. Thank you, Manuel. Thank you for having me. Yes, absolutely. So I guess a little bit of context about UrbanX and what we do first. UrbanX is a venture accelerator for startups reimagining city life, built by Mini from the BMW Group and the venture fund Urban Us. And what we do is that we actually invest in technologies that address the challenges related to living in a hyper-urbanized world. Most of us are probably connecting from cities or typically live in cities. And that is because of the physical proximity in cities has proven to offer significant benefits. I often say that there's this kind of magic of being close to each other. And at Workblazer has studied this in depth and was mentioning some of these benefits, including higher innovation rates, professional opportunities, more capital available, more cultural stimuli, and even longer lives, which is a concept that I really love. That said, the challenges of urban living are equally as significant, and it is not by chance that the spread of COVID-19 has thrived in high density urban settings. At UrbanX, we believe that startups hold the key to solve for some of these urban challenges. And of course, startups don't operate in a vacuum. We need government, we need large organizations, but they provide a bottom-up approach to bringing new solutions to the market that can be a very healthy backbone to our economies. In the last 4 years at UrbanX, we have invested and helped launch 51 startups in the US, Europe, and Asia across verticals such as mobility and transportation, real estate and construction, energy, water, waste, civic, and government technologies. As you can probably imagine, most of these companies either sell to cities or operate in highly regulated environments. And over the last few weeks, we've seen the pandemic of COVID-19 unfold, and something that's got me not just very busy, but also very positive and hopeful is seeing how some of our companies have responded to a crisis with impactful solutions that they already had. They have either modified them slightly to adjust to new conditions, or they have created them from scratch. And I think these unprecedented times have also made visible three things. And I think Emmanuel was asking for a bit of a framework or statement. So I think, yeah, what has made a little bit clearer for us is, one, how brittle some of our systems are. Two, how we need better frameworks for public-private collaboration that can be preemptive of emergency situations. So think about, for instance, pre-negotiating with Uber and Lyft the services that they would be able to provide in case of a natural disaster or pandemic. And three, on the more proactive front, and where I would like to focus my attention now for the next minute or two, is they have clarified which areas need further support and investment. And when I'm talking about these areas and solutions, I'm not talking about short term and for the next few months. I'm talking about companies that will be able to scale over the next 10 years, and because they respond to a global phenomena, they also have this global applicability, if you will. So while I'm still in the processing mode, or still processing this information, I wanted to share these three key areas where I hope to see more investment, both because of need, but also because of opportunity. One would be resilient infrastructure for basic needs. Two would be government and communication. And three, climate and planning for natural disasters. For one, resilient infrastructure for basic needs, I think I was just talking to brittleness of some of our systems, and I think we should be investing in diverse solutions that provide a certain degree of redundancy in areas such as food supply, energy, water, mobility for those in need, and healthcare. And two companies, Emmanuel was also asking me, like, provide specific examples. Two companies that come to mind are, one, Therma, a company dedicated to securing the cold chain of our food supply system, which leads to loads and loads of food waste. And two, Eva, which is a company building the infrastructure of drone mobility, and they're focused on delivery and supply chain risks, which are particularly critical for healthcare, pharmacies, and homebound elderly populations. Then kind of going to the next area where we would love to see more investment would be government and communication. If we believe that we're going to see more natural disasters and pandemic in the next decades that we have seen in the past, we need to equip our governments with the right tools and data to be able to respond. One thing that kind of always amazes me is how, unlike most companies, governments don't have a feedback loop from citizens. And so a company that kind of stands out to me is a company called CT Beats. They are able to collect, they use natural language processing to collect the voices and the opinions of people through social media, but also other text-based data. And they're able to provide that to governments. And they currently have this like social observatories for COVID-19 to understand what are the specific problems in like going down to the post-Kotoko district related to the current crisis. Yeah, the pandemic is the same, but the problems related to the pandemic can be very diverse. And three, climate planning and for natural disasters. The imbalance with our environment is here to stay, and as a result, we need to keep investing both in hard infrastructure that supports our cities and in carbon reduction. And two companies that stand out are robotics and Hades, and they both work on maintenance. For robotics, is maintenance of roads, and Hades is maintenance of sewage systems. And they both use computer vision to identify cracks and help local governments make the right decisions in terms of when and where to maintain or rebuild. So just to wrap up, my hope is that we continue to see more of these solutions, and that I think that is a great time to reflect and create a compass for action in the years to come.
Thank you so much, Miriam. I'm still going to come back to the conversation about like interesting solutions that you're seeing across the world, but I'm going to turn this over to George now, who has recently published a report on digital solutions for the urban poor. That conversation is one that not enough people have. And I'm curious to hear from Jodie's perspective whether African cities work for the urban poor, and in what ways can digital solutions help solve the problem of urbanization without growth. Over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Emmanuel. Great to be able to speak on such an important topic. Although obviously it's a difficult time. I think the current events are also showing that this is a very important topic for us to look at. So just a bit of background on the GSMA before I present my slides. The GSMA represents mobile operators worldwide, uniting more than 750 operators and 400 companies in the broader mobile ecosystem. And within the GSMA, the Mobile for Development program seeks to leverage mobile technology to drive the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. Now, if we look at rapid urbanization in Africa, two things stand out. So 90% of urban growth from now until 2050 will be concentrated in Africa and Asia. And Africa Polis, a really cool geospatial database on urbanization in Africa, predicts that African cities will add an additional 1 billion people to themselves or to new cities from now until 2050. And if you look at the map on the right-hand side, you'll see that you'll see a lot of cities that you might not be so familiar with, or that might not be on top of mind of many urban policymakers, like for instance, Mbui Mai in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or Onitsha in the DRC, in Nigeria. And important to mention, obviously, with these population projections is that they're not that accurate, but it shows that the bulk of sort of urban growth is concentrated in African cities. And it's important for urban policymakers, donors, and innovators to focus on that. Could we go to the next slide, please? Another important fact about urban growth in Africa, though, is that contrary to sort of urbanization trajectories in East Asia or in the West, urbanization in Africa is not necessarily correlated with GDP per capita growth or even structural transformation. So you see in countries like Guinea-Bissau, Madagascar, and Cameroon, between 1990 and 2016, the share of urban population has gone up, while GDP per capita has actually decreased. This trend has very important implications for the density at which urbanization in Africa occurs. We might often think about informal settlements like Makoko in Lagos or Kibera in Kenya as like very dense spaces, but they're actually not that dense if you consider height as a key variable of density. And because obviously they're urbanizing in an urban sprawl that is very decentralized in a sense, and that has important implications for the costs of sewer and piped water infrastructure in these cities, because they're acutely sensitive to the density at which urbanization occurs. And it's also important, it also sort of poses an array of different challenges to urban policymakers to deal with a context in which most of your urban population growth is concentrated in informal settlements. UN Habitat already estimates that in low-income countries, about 63% of the population live in informal settlements, but given the rapid growth of cities, this figure could even increase further, and it has important implications. Next slide, please. So one of the key concerns that we focused on in our report on digital solutions for the urban poor is to what extent rapid urbanization poses challenges to basic service delivery when it comes to basic services such as energy, water, sanitation, and waste management. And we've seen that in 11 out of 39 sub-Saharan African countries, access to at least basic water services has actually decreased for the urban poor, the bottom 20% in the income distribution over the last 15 years. And we've seen a rise in kind of private water service providers, such as private tanker fleets. And in Nigeria, the figure of private tankers, for instance, in Lagos, has quadrupled over the last decade. And that has important implications because those private tankers are often more expensive to access for the urban poor, and they often spend a lot of time to collect water even. Another important trend is that urban population growth has significantly outpaced sewer access in most of Africa. And we also see the urban poor, for instance, as you can see the example in Malawi, being way less likely to have access to safe, to at least basic sanitation services than the top 20%, which have, where 74% of the top 20% have access to sanitation services in Malawi. Similarly, we see this inequality in access also showing important implications in the energy and waste management sector. I'll let you read the examples for yourself, but we can come back to these challenges later on. So we can go on the next slide. In that context, it's important to mention that digital solutions and the rise of mobile connectivity, not only the rise of mobile connectivity through mobile money, but also mobile internet adoption and also smartphone penetration serve as an important foundation on which innovations in African cities can thrive. Although mobile internet penetration in Africa is only 24%, according to the GSMA, you're 40% more likely to have a connection to mobile internet if you're in an urban area rather than in a rural area. So that has an important implication for the kinds of innovations that are possible in an urban environment. And we've also seen the registered mobile money accounts in sub-Saharan Africa rise to 181 million as of 2019, according to the GSMA State of the Industry report on mobile money that was released last year. And the kind of innovations that can thrive on this kind of foundation of mobile connectivity are, for instance, pay-as-you-go. We've seen this applied a lot in the energy sector and off-grid solar, but it's been also now being applied to the urban water sector, to the urban sanitation sector to an extent. And this technology allows low-income users to access services on a pay-as-you-go basis that they previously could not afford because that pay-as-you-go model wasn't there. And it's all sort of being done on the foundation of mobile money. And we also see a rise in GIS tracking, smart metering, IoT, and big data solutions that different innovators are leveraging in different contexts. But I'll talk a bit in more detail about the different innovators that are using these solutions in the next slide. Another important point why we think it's quite interesting to see urban innovations progress in Africa is that digital business progression is very different from traditional business progression. And given that a lot of African cities are comprised of very large informal sectors, it's interesting to think about what roles sort of mobile apps can play in creating a pathway towards formality, which isn't so radical, like informal to formal. You can go to registering a social media account, to getting a mobile money account, getting license and permits. And then you have different steps to formality, which can allow different mobile app providers to leverage informal sectors dynamism. We've seen this in Indonesia, where super apps like Gojek are attracting a lot of investments, but we're also seeing it in Nigeria, where a lot of ride-hailing apps are trying to do the same thing. The next slide, please. And we believe that given sort of the fact that a lot of informal settlements don't have access to basic services is obviously a huge challenge. But for African cities to really become engines of productivity, they have to do better on basic service provision. And there we can leverage some of the innovations that we've seen from the mobile sector to also make basic service provision more affordable. And I've now listed some of the companies that are really exciting on this subject, like WonderKid or CityTabs in the water sector, which are helping African water utilities reduce non-revenue water, provide services to different, to help them extend services to the urban poor. And we also see companies leveraging pay-as-you-go clean cooking solutions like Copagas, which was recently acquired in the single biggest equity investment in the clean cooking sector by Safaricom, and this company is enabling a lot of women living in informal settlements that use dirty cooking techniques to access clean cooking techniques. And we can go more into the different solutions that are available, but the GSMA Mobile for Development Utilities team is really excited about the potential that partnerships between municipalities and urban utilities, mobile operators, and innovators can have in different African cities.
Thanks, George. So yeah, we're just going to jump right into the conversation. I think I want to start with Ed on this one. George just spoke about the lack of correlations.
I think we lost Emmanuel. I think he's.
You want me to, shall I guess that Emmanuel wants me to talk about about urbanization and income in Africa? Maybe I should guess that.
I think so.
Can you hear me?
Okay, why don't I talk a little bit? So this phenomenon of which Ingrid talked about, which is urbanization without industrialization or urbanization without growth, was first noted in the 1960s in Latin America, where we noticed that, you know, Mexico became 50% urban in about 1960 with per capita income of about $4,000. Brazil 4 years later with per capita income of about $2,500. This is all in modern dollars. By context, the US only became 50% urban in 1920 as a country. And we had a per capita income in modern dollars of about $8,000. So we were really much richer when we became that urban. Then a second wave of concern with this occurred in Africa around 20 years ago. Canning and Fay documented it and so forth. I think there's an easy way to understand this, which is in the old world of closed economies, meaning economies in which you couldn't trade, in which you had to feed yourself, you needed to have healthy agricultural surpluses and your own domestic transportation infrastructure to move the food from the farms to the cities. And in fact, typically, increasing farm productivity in a closed economy is actually what enables cities to grow. It's only when you have agricultural surpluses that you can actually enable people to, you know, spend time in urban areas, weaving cloth in the medieval period or making cars and so forth. But we now live in an open world and you don't need to provide the food yourself. And so if you live in a country which is, for whatever reason, endowed with agricultural deficits, right? Your farms are actually not very productive by global standards. And of course, remember, many of the world's countries today are poor precisely because their agriculture is not in a temperate, rich area. Then, in an open economy, it makes sense for you not to be in agriculture and for people to come to cities. So in many cases in the developing world today, we see actually urbanization happen because of agricultural poverty, not because of agricultural richness. And that's really the flip. It's a sort of a great twist. And the way that economists understand this is it's the result of the switch from closed economies to open economies. And there's a fair amount of data to support this interpretation of what happened. That does not mean that urbanization is bad in when it's associated, with agricultural weakness rather than agricultural strength. But it does mean that urbanization is more difficult. It does mean that actually dealing with the problems of cities becomes harder. I should also say that, in the case of Latin America, everyone was worried about this in the 1960s. The reason they're not worried about it today is, of course, the Latin American cities got a lot richer over the next 40 or 50 years because the cities were pathways out of poverty into prosperity. And I think in Africa as well, many of those countries did show positive trajectories, but I think the current view is that Africa has had a good 15 or 20 years and that cities have been part of that process. But that being said, there's no question that urbanizing on a per capita GDP of $500 is vastly harder than urbanizing on a per capita income of $5,000. And that's exactly the African challenge. And it's made all the more challenging because urban density still brings with it the same downsides when you're poor than it does when you're rich. It still leads to the congestion that Astrid showed us of the matutus in Kampala, or even more terribly, the spread of contagious disease. And so that's why innovation is even more vital. Luckily, we have these data tools and we have the ability of sort of a connected world to help on this thing. But very much the sort of urbanization plus poverty, it still can be a path out of poverty, but it does create enormous difficulties.
Thanks, Ed. I'm going to flip the question to Astrid in a slightly different way. So I know you do a lot of research that's meant to advise policymakers on these sort of things. If you were to be the mayor of an African city or the governor of an African city, what are the things that you prioritize in order to support one, urban innovation and entrepreneurship, and basically just set the city on a path? Like, what are the first steps you will take on the path to progress?
Yeah, so I'll caveat my answer that I'm very, very humbled by the fact that it's always easier to give the advice than have to implement it yourself. And so also when I talk to policymakers, that's the frame of mind that I take, because obviously a lot of the technical solutions, the best practice solutions that come out of research are not always the solutions that work in the political situations we see in a lot of our cities. And so we've got to sort of frame it around that. I'm going to tag your answer to a question as well that was asked in the chat by Pascal, who was asking what are the sort of policies that promote access to rights and services for the urban poor, because I really do think that one of the things that is holding a lot of the African cities back is the question of land tenure and the complexness of land tenure. I come from one of the cities with the most complex land tenure systems. There are 4 or 5 different systems operating right next to each other, and the administrative structures that would even tell you which system is applicable where are not there, right? And that causes a lot of questions about ownership. It means that land cannot be put to its most productive use, but most importantly, it means that people are very vulnerable even when they're on their land and in a city, and they have no sense of security on which to build their livelihoods or which to invest. And so I think regularization of property rights and finding innovative ways to do that doesn't mean like massive land titling schemes or anything else. It means just bringing people into the net, perhaps even under the ownership structures that they already have, but recognizing those and trying to formalize those is the first step in unleashing sort of the power of land and the power of the city. But also it has then added benefits of then you recognize who the poor are, because often the poor and the most vulnerable are also the most invisible. You're able to then figure out how to provide them services. But in the long run, and this is something that also has to be said, you can bring them into the tax net, because there's no way that we're going to be able to do everything that we need to do in the current incomes that sit, or in the current budgets that cities have. And so we do have to expand our tax net. But the sense of ownership that you can create when people have sort of a title in some form, it doesn't have to be a formal title, but some sort of formalized ownership of their land, means that they suddenly may also feel more ownership of their city. That could create a virtuous cycle and then sort of bring it in. But again, caveated, it's always easier to dish out the advice than to have to implement it yourself.
Nice. Let me ask George a slightly similar question, which is, so assume that, as Astrid said, so we've done like a lot of the digital rights work, or like digitization of our lands and things like that. The government ideally is now getting taxes from land and things like that. First thing is this all, and maybe I will say they can also chime in there, is this all dependent on government, or in what ways can entrepreneurs partner with the government on this? Share your thoughts on what an ideal partnership framework looks like from a government to private sector participation.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think government in basic service provision, obviously government is key. But as I highlighted in my presentation right now, when it comes to basic service provision, a lot of African cities and governments are struggling to provide basic services efficiently. So what's possible is to look at partnerships as a route out of this. And I think when we look at Africa's urban innovation ecosystem a bit more broadly, there are a lot of different players that we have to sort of consider as important. So one of them obviously being mobile operators, because they provide a critical infrastructure that a lot of African users use daily, but also sort of other corporate entities, as well as NGOs and community-based organizations. And if we look at some of the partnership models that work well in this kind of context, I was beginning to describe one of our mobile for development utilities innovation fund grantees, WonderKid. Their slogan that I really like is everyday IT solutions. And they started working with one water utility in Kenya to digitize their billing and complaint management operations, and are now working with over 30 water utilities in 5 different African countries. And this is a kind of partnership model that leverages innovation and targets it at a need that a lot of African countries face when it comes to basic service provision, reducing non-revenue water, extending water to the urban poor. So this is a partnership model where we see a lot of potential, and this can also be applied to other sectors, such as sanitation, where Sanergy is a very exciting startup that is working in Nairobi. And if you look at what Sanergy is doing, they've actually they've now entered in a formal partnership with the Nairobi City Authority, and they've collected and treated over 70,000 tons of fecal sludge and have provided access to safe sanitation to over 116,000 residents in Nairobi through a container-based sanitation solution. Obviously, container-based sanitation applies to a context where you don't have sewer access, but in a lot of African cities, that simply is the case. And it's important to kind of think about how innovators can help bridge a gap, because if sort of from a policy perspective, the only sort of goal is to increase sewer access, that's great and that's necessary. But in the meantime, a lot of the urban poor won't have access to safe sanitation. So we have to look at innovative solutions beyond sewer access. And I think government can play a great role in giving an opportunity for local or other innovators to showcase their solutions to really improve basic services.
Right. Thanks. I can already see some questions coming in through the chat. Please send your questions. We'll take as many as we can. But I wanted to ask Bosse a question, which is, so yes, we talk about partnership with governments, right? But there have also been cases where, like I mentioned earlier, one government decision or one policy decision pretty much wipes out a company's business model, right, completely. What are your thoughts and what are your recommendations on how companies or organizations can effectively engage government stakeholders in order to make meaningful change happen?
So, I mean, to be honest, I think that government's role, I think it was Astrid that mentioned that, will continue to be sort of creating an enabling environment. Government is a facilitator. So the regulatory and sort of the policy framework is what government does, right? I think that what a lot of businesses do not do that government as well needs to be sort of more forthcoming with co-creating, especially with entrepreneurs. So that's also very critical. But again, it's with both parties understanding that everybody has a role to play, because government cannot do it all. I was just thinking about the fact that with the work that we do, for example, we literally have proved to the commercial institutions why they should be lending to a market segment that they didn't think they should be lending to, right? And if you think on the other hand around payment solutions, how these commercial institutions have sort of adopted the payment solutions by innovators and entrepreneurs. So there's a lot of partnership that's going on that's leading to sort of the larger impact and change that we see around different areas, you know, whether it be payments or whether it be transportation and all the other things. But I think my core recommendation will be with both parties willing to sort of engage and have conversations and dialogue and collaborate, because we do bring very unique sort of strengths to the table.
Right. And so Miriam, so all of this sounds all nice and good, but how easy is it to actually innovate within the urban space, right? I know it's notoriously difficult to work in that space. Can you guys hear me? Yes, I was directing this question to Miriam just to say, I'd like to hear your thoughts on how easy or difficult is it to actually innovate within the urban space, and what are the critical factors required for success, basically?
Yeah, absolutely. I think related to the conversation that was just happening in terms of startups and government, I think that either startups selling to government or startups operating in highly regulated environments, that relationship needs to be very active. And that I think can have like really positive impact on both like the startups in being able to grow, but also on the government being able to fulfill their needs with solutions that that are coming to the market. I think some of the challenges have to do with like when you're selling to government, there's a much longer sales process than selling to a regular customer, for instance, and the ecosystem is more complicated to figure out typically. So for governments that have standard procurement processes, figuring those out and being eligible even for some of those contracts is a challenge. So yeah, in some ways, what we found is that some of the startups that we work with have had to, in some ways, like educate governments in terms of how they can create contracts with them, what other cities are doing. And on the flip side, one thing that we do see is that when there's a city that has implemented one specific solution, typically other cities want that as well if it has worked before. So if you produce like a really good case scenario of this has worked in solving this specific problem in the city, then it's easier to scale to other cities because they kind of like copy each other in some ways. So I think that's like the one thing that we recommend is this idea of like creating like a case that then can be kind of sold to other cities. And then I think just solving for real problems is the other kind of big recommendation. And how that manifests itself often is there a budget line in the government corresponding to what you're trying to solve for? So for instance, road maintenance, sewage maintenance, like those kinds of things, governments have specific budget lines dedicated to that. And if you're able to produce a solution that is lighter weight, cheaper, more like easier to deploy, then that's where there is a significant opportunity. But when we talk, like sometimes there are startups that are more like data and like insights, and those are harder to kind of sell because there's not a specific kind of use case that they have kind of developed.
Nice. So I mean, like with all that's happening in the world today, we've seen companies' business models literally like shift overnight in order to be able to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance. I'm curious to get your thoughts on how all that's happening right now has the potential to shape or reshape emerging cities. What trends would you say are likely going to emerge over the coming weeks and months? And if there's any indication on where we need to start focusing investment, I'd really love to hear your thoughts.
So the big American news of the morning was that we had 6.5 million unemployment claims, and this was fairly predictable. 1/5 of the American labor force work in 3 sectors: hospitality, leisure, and retail trade, which are enormously vulnerable to COVID-19, although probably as we look forward, all of the economy will end up being vulnerable to COVID-19. In a sense, over the past 50 years, what we've seen in the urban world is we've moved from farms to factories. And then as factories became more capital intensive and they left cities, vast numbers of people moved into service sectors. And the jobs that existed in cities depended upon face-to-face contact. Face-to-face contact is, after all, what cities provide that is so valuable. But unfortunately, in a world of pandemic, face-to-face contact is also deadly. And so the sort of long trend towards face-to-face connection, towards, you know, people earning a living, selling a smile as they made you a coffee in a Starbucks, or being a pleasant person in an office or in professional services, that whole urban world is just astoundingly vulnerable to COVID-19. And I think that's what we're experiencing around us in the wealthy world and the not wealthy world. I feel fairly confident that you know, there'll be enormous dislocations in the West, but that eventually we'll get through this. And the you know, money printing machine is already there to pump trillions of dollars and to try and shield the human harm from this. The stakes are much higher in Africa. As countries like Uganda shut down, there isn't the same level of safety net. There are not the same level of resources. The natural solution, which is to just try to get people short-term resources to carry them through, becomes a lot harder in a world of limited financial capacity. In many cases, you'd like to just give people food to get them through it, but even there, the distribution of that becomes enormously hard. But that's really what we need to be focused on in those countries where we really are shutting down, is how do we make sure that there are emergency supplies that are actually going into slum areas to mitigate the downsides of this. Then once we're past this, the question is, how can we make sure that this is not a permanent part of our urban world? The whole model that we've built, a model particularly around face-to-face services, whether or not we're thinking about a market in Kampala or in a high-end service company in Seattle, that whole world is, you know, enormously vulnerable to contagion and pandemic. And unless we have better monitoring from the beginning, unless we have the better ability to produce vaccines quickly, that world will end up being quite vulnerable. And so I think it really is, the good news is we're all in this together as a world, and presumably the whole resources of the wealthy world will actually be there trying to solve this problem in a way that actually for once benefits the poor world as well. So I at least think that there is some chance that we'll get through this, but anyone who looks at this and doesn't see this as being sort of a mortal threat to our connected urban system is underestimating the challenge.
Interesting. Astrid, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this question as well.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts sitting in a very locked down city here. And also for anyone who's interested, I actually published my thoughts this morning in an article on the Conversation Africa on what I think is the sort of effect. I totally understand the need to lock down, right, and the need for social distancing in the age of a pandemic. And particularly in a country that has already, and this goes for many of much of sub-Saharan Africa, countries with weak health systems already. I mean, a staggering stat is that, you know, New York predicts that with a moderate, you know, outbreak of the epidemic, and I'm pretty sure they're past moderate, so I'm pretty sure the statistic is out of date, but that they would, the US, they would need 200,000 ICU beds. In the whole of Uganda, we have 55 ICU beds, right? And so we can't afford, our health system can't afford to be able to take on the sort of pandemic infection rates that we see across Europe, the US, and parts of Asia. That being said, I should also note, of those 55 ICU beds, 80% are still in Kampala, right? So you're still able to get the sort of you're still able to get urban services, and this is why a lot of people move to cities, because the service provision is relatively better than in rural areas. It's one sort of big driver of rural urban migration. I think, personally, the big impact, you know, whilst we may weather the health storm, and I don't know to what extent we will, and time will tell on that, the big impact is going to be economically. There was a survey of the informal sector in Kampala, which showed that nearly 60% of them are own businesses. They survive off daily face-to-face interactions. We are a city of the informal service sector. This is across, like most African cities, people survive on selling and providing services. We are now currently fully locked down, yet the same survey that did those that looked at the informal sector also found that even before we were locked down, 93% of the informal sector was operating close to or already below the poverty line, right? And so, as Ed highlighted, we don't have the fiscal space to provide the social safety nets, and so this is going to be the consequences beyond the health impact. The economic consequences are going to be dire. That being said, in a post-COVID world, you know, the reason for rural urban migration across a lot of Africa and really, you know, across a lot of the world throughout its history has been that the opportunities, the economic opportunities in cities are better. So whilst, you know, in the West, I appreciate there may be some sort of shift because now people realize that they can work from home and so they may not need office spaces. And so we may see sort of a reforming of the urban structure. I actually do think that in Africa, post-COVID, we're going to see an even bigger flock, you know, perhaps even faster move from people to cities as we try and weather the economic storm that is already hitting us and that is likely to have very long-term effects. So that those are just sort of some personal views on that.
Interesting. Bosse, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question. So Lagos is Africa's largest city, like you mentioned, right? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how Lagos is responding to this, because whether we like it or not, like people are looking to see how Lagos responds. But much more importantly, I'm also interested in hearing your views on what you see entrepreneurs doing in the front line of the battle. So are there interesting examples of entrepreneurs rising to the challenge of like providing immediate response to this challenge?
So I think, you know, to be honest, I think there has been a lot of sort of accolades to the government of Lagos for their response. I think it has to do with the fact that they've been very transparent and the fact that they've been communicating very regularly. So people want to know. This is not the time to sort of keep information from people. So I think they appreciate that. There's also a very interesting trend around private sector sort of rising to the occasion and collaborating with government to make things happen and make them happen quickly because we are in a crisis. But if I start to think about some of the, you know, we've been having calls, long calls, and we're thinking about strategies because as we have 11,000 businesses in our portfolio and a lot of them are writing in, of course, these are loans and they cannot meet their obligations. And so thinking around moratoriums, of course, for them, but even beyond that, it's now how do we support post the crisis? And to your point, there's going to be a lot of funding into healthcare. I think that will be inevitable because we now all recognize the importance of our sort of healthcare system. I think that the whole supply chain conversation and how that happens, so logistics, that's also going to be very critical. From the skills perspective, I think that there's going to be an increase in terms of investment and support for digital skills, just because, I mean, if you look at how people are going to be working in the future, then those become really critical. And this will not just be about, you know, typically the working class, but how do you provide access to these digital skills for sort of low income young people? And I think, you know, so just thinking around that, and then of course, how to fund that as government would be some of the things that will be keeping us awake over the next few days. But I definitely think there's an opportunity for entrepreneurs. I definitely know that there are hackathons now going on because, I mean, there's certain areas that government feels like we need to hack this and we need to do it fast. So again, it's about collaboration and how we do that. It's about really where the funding is coming from. And then it's about how we plan for the future so that we don't find ourselves where we are now when this sort of things happens again.
Yeah. Thanks for that. George, so a lot has been said about the urban poor, informal settlements, slums, and things like that. But the reality across a lot of African cities is that sometimes slums are treated as a bug, so to speak, in that megacity concept, right? Almost like, hey, we're trying to create this shiny idea of a megacity without slums. I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on that, and in what ways can entrepreneurs, I guess, help to make life better for both everyone, whether in formal or informal settlements.
Yeah. I mean, we something that we've noticed throughout sort of our research on this topic is that African city governments of all political persuasions often kind of view informal settlements as like a problem to be solved, which obviously to a certain extent they are, but they are also important reservoirs of innovation, and because the bulk of the urban poor are concentrated in them, it's important to not only approach them in this way. And one way to kind of highlight this sort of approach of African governments is if you look at, for instance, water and sanitation subsidies and who they target. Actually, you'll be shocked that according to the World Bank, 56% of water and sanitation subsidies that are given out by African governments go to the top 20%, and only 6% go to the bottom 20%. So that just shows that a lot of the subsidy programs, for instance, for clean water provision, are based on the fact if you have a piped water connection or if you have a sewage connection. So that's problematic, and I think there's scope for African cities to work with innovative service providers to redirect some of those funds to actually reach the most vulnerable people. And another thing which isn't directly related to your question, but I did want to highlight it in the context of this discussion on urban innovation in Africa, is we've also seen an exciting trend in the rise of tech hubs in Africa. So we have a team in the GSMA called Ecosystem Accelerator that tracks the rise of tech hubs in Africa every year, and we've grown from 314 in 2016 to 618 in 2019. Obviously, having a tech hub doesn't necessarily imply that you're going to have a great innovative ecosystem, but it is an important indicator. And there are a lot of corporates, such as mobile operators, such as Orange Digital Ventures or Liquid Telecom. Orange Digital Ventures is doing a lot of different tech hubs throughout Francophone Africa, Liquid Telecom throughout East Africa, but also players such as Google and Facebook. And these tech hubs often have the scope, as we were hearing about different COVID hackathons, for instance, also to kind of include informal settlements in urban policies, urban service provision and urban policies, and to think about solutions which can answer the challenges that different informal settlements have. And we've also seen a lot of innovative solutions come from the very people that live in these informal settlements. So actually thinking about them as creators to the solutions that they themselves face is quite important.
Nice. In the short time that we have left, I'm going to ask like one round of questions, and I want to direct the next one to Astrid. Following the line of thought that George just shared, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on large government investments in so-called smart cities, right? And like special economic zones and things like that, but also specifically around those that are meant to create almost artificially a hub to support entrepreneurs. And we see a lot of that springing up across Africa, from Konza City in Kenya to Sene City in the Republic, all across the continent, right? I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Emmanuel, you've picked on one of my pain points. I want to just reflect on one point that Miriam said before, which is finding solutions to problems that we actually have. And I feel the rise of the word smart city has created this whole market for solutions to problems that we didn't even know we had, and that they're being sold at a very expensive cost. And the problem with that is that then the problems that we do have are then not addressed, because we are very much constrained from a resource perspective. I'm all for supporting entrepreneurship. I am all for supporting innovation. As I said in my opening remarks, I think this is the way that we're going to manage and grow and invest in Africa's cities. However, I think that we need to make sure that they target the majority of the population, right? Ensure that the solutions that are coming out, I like to reframe the word smart to things that are actually going to be useful, right? So how do we create public transport systems that can transport people? How do we create, how do we put sewage systems? And some of the answers we have, some of the answers are like we found in Roman times, right? And we're just, right now it's a question of how we implement them. And so I think, in the low resource environment that we have, there's great trade-offs in terms of what you need to invest in terms of money, but also a lot of opportunity cost if you get it wrong. And so I would really, the term smart city, I think in my mind is extremely problematic because it hasn't yet captured what it means. I think sort of reframing the conversation to finding solutions that support the majority of the urban population and create affordable, livable, and productive cities, that's smart. And so directing sort of our energies and our resources towards that is key.
Yeah. If I could just jump in quickly here, to re-emphasize Astrid's point, if we look at sort of VC investment in African startups in the last year as well, 1.3 billion was invested, which is a record figure. But most of this investment obviously goes into the fintech sector and to companies like InterSwitch, OPay, PalmPay, which I'm not saying don't have a real impact on people's life. They definitely do. But it's important also that some of this investment in innovations also goes into other sectors. And here it's been encouraging to see the rise of investments into companies such as Rensource and Arnergy in Nigeria, which are off-grid solar providers that are providing sort of solar services to urban businesses. And I think that's quite encouraging, and it'll be important to match more VC investment and also DFI investment with actual social value and development impact. Yeah.
Nice. I'm tempted to ask one more question for everyone. So I'll just take this. I would already have that much time. We have 5 minutes left on this call, but I want to ask Ed one final question, which is, a lot has been said about, and then I'll just let everyone give like their final remarks here. But to Ed specifically, a lot has been said about Africa leapfrogging the world with technology, right, in various ways. But I'm curious to get your thoughts on like basic infrastructure. Like, can we actually like leapfrog basic? I mean, there are conversations around like using drones for last mile delivery, for instance, if there are no roads. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on what actually counts as basic infrastructure.
It's funny. I've been doing my best to respond to as many of the questions that were online as I could, and I was just writing about sewers when you called for me.
Nice.
It doesn't matter how great your cell phone network is. It is not a substitute for sewers. Okay, you actually need to have basic stuff that gets clean water in, that gets waste taken out, and those investments are expensive. And don't forget, they need to be maintained and managed. And you need to have some sort of a financing structure. There's no sidestepping those. Now, good information technology can still be helpful. It can tell us when the problems go down. It can help tell us, identify what the benefits of it. But African cities really do need a concerted and large-scale investment in the basic infrastructure that makes them sanitary and safe. And I want to highlight something that came out of my own work on water in Lusaka. We often think about clean water as being about waterborne diseases like cholera, okay? But if your water doesn't run, you can't wash your hands. And one of the things that we found was that when the water went out in Zambia, respiratory illnesses went up. This seems particularly relevant in an age of COVID, that in fact we need to have water flowing and soap, and that actually requires expensive infrastructure. It can be privately provided, it can be publicly provided. It can be funded by general tax revenues, it can be funded by local property taxes, whatever works for the particular area. And I just want to end with just a final point, which relates to what Astrid said about watching local conditions, is that most of the time in government, capacity is more important than policy. Right? All the clever ideas we have in the world are irrelevant if the local government doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have the people on the ground, and doesn't have the financial resources to make it work. And so, when I think about the sort of future of African cities, getting the capacity to build the basic sanitary infrastructure to reduce the plagues of the future is, I think, the most important thing on the agenda.
Astrid, what are your final thoughts?
I'm just gonna re-echo what Ed said, because, in an age of COVID-19, when 56% of urban dwellers across the continent, only 56% have access to water, and that is that, they can access it in 30 minutes. Washing your hands for 20 seconds regularly is not something that is feasible. When 71% of Kampalans, so in my own city, when 71% of families live in one room, maintaining social distances of 2 meters is not feasible, right? So if we need to plan for the pandemic of the future, but actually even more so, rather than just planning for the next pandemic, if we wanted to make our cities livable, then we got to address these basic solutions. And just to end on my first point, which is 2/3 of our cities is still to come, right? Let's think about ensuring that we can get those right, because retrofitting is costly. We're not doing a good job of it already. And to do that for 2/3 of more than what we've had right now is going to be impossible. So let's really think about the future. And here I also want to just highlight one final point, which is some of our biggest cities 20 years from now are ones that we don't even know exist. And those are maybe secondary cities now. They may be just blips on maps. So let's think about not just the primary cities, the Lagoses, the Kampalas of this world. Let's also think about our secondary neighbors. Thank you.
Thank you. Bosse.
So, I mean, we don't have a lot of time, but I think my big thing would be, especially a government like Lagos that's willing and open. I think that there should be more collaboration, and that we should actually find opportunities to have these conversations about how to actually make urban innovation happen. That would be my thing. Thank you.
Thanks. Miriam.
Yeah, I think, like, to me, the word is resilience in many ways, and resilience for basic needs, and building systems and networks and that have that flexibility and that kind of overcapacity in some ways to be able to withstand whatever comes our way. And yeah, like, reflect on what are actually our basic needs. And I guess to pay attention to, I do think that urban tech and new technologies hold the key to some of these innovations, and that we don't need to develop how we've done in the past. There are new opportunities that are much lighter, but we need to be able to also bring the informal economies into a formal system. And so governments need to be aligned in that to facilitate it.
Thank you so much. Judge, final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, tough to go last after so many great thoughts. First of all, I highlighted a lot of the challenges African cities face in terms of basic service provision, but I'm still very, very excited and positive about sort of African urban futures, because I think some of the innovations that we've talked about today have a lot of potential to reshape Africa's urban trajectory. That being said, obviously, I'm not a proponent of sort of we can sort of leapfrog into sort of into the future and can simply sort of overstep every basic step that is necessary. But the key is to understand what we can leapfrog and what we can't leapfrog. So I think that question, to investigate that question in a bit more depth will be quite interesting. And I think one of the key things for African urban innovation in general will be sort of to find out which kind of partnership models deliver real value to African innovators and African startups. And there, it's great to see a lot of different sort of mobile operators providing partnership opportunities for startups, but also other large players as well as governments. And I think another area where we can look at whether it's quite accommodative for innovation or not is regulation, and to see whether sort of certain regulations in sectors such as waste management, energy, water, or sanitation could be made a bit tailored a bit more so that cities have the opportunity to pilot new innovations, and then those innovations could maybe be taken forward on a countrywide level. And there, obviously, what's really important as well is to kind of look at the south-south flow of our ideas, and to kind of look at what different cities in Asia have done to solve some of the challenges we've talked about today as well, because I think some of them could serve as inspiration for a lot of African cities as well, although obviously every innovative solution works best when it's tailored to local context.
Nice, nice. Thank you so much, everyone. This has been really good. I'm really grateful for your time. I'm just going to spend the last 1 minute on this call to quickly introduce the Urban Innovation Challenge that Utopia is running in Lagos. So we're opening call for applications for this next week, Monday. And the theme for the challenge is, how can we shape the Lagos of tomorrow? Basically, a lot has been said about COVID-19, the future, and all of that, and the role that urban innovators can play. The question that we're asking is, what does that future look like, and how does your solution make cities better for everyone, including those in slums and informal settlements, right? And we're going to be looking at a number of urban things, from energy to mobility to civic tech, food, waste and water, to built environments, public health and safety, and things like that. And this challenge is open to everyone, every early stage team basically, with at least a minimum viable product that address the challenge. And these are some of the benefits that winners stand to get from being part of the challenge. And there's still more to come. But we've designed, or we're working on a virtual urban accelerator program that you'll be a part of. We also have a network of investors that we're going to curate access to equity investing and funding opportunities. Every one of the semi-finalists get access to $10,000 in AWS credits valid for 2 years. We've secured workspace vouchers from Lagos, and they'll be eligible for workspace vouchers from Lagos Innovates. And very importantly, we're also going to facilitate access to the relevant government agencies that allow innovators scale. And then leveraging our global network of experts and partners, we're going to be able to connect innovators that are working on urban solutions in Lagos to a lot of these partners. And when we do launch our City Lab space in Lagos, which we plan to, you'll get 6 months priority access to the space. We also do have a studio in Silicon Valley right now, and you can always like walk across and get access to that as well. There's more to come, but the key thing to note is that the call for applications are open on Monday. You can check out the website. In the recap email that we sent from this event, we'll share the recordings from this event on Monday, but also a formal announcement when the call for applications open. We ask that you please share and anyone that you think this would be of benefit for. And if there are any organizations that you think need to be a part of this, resources partners, get them to send me an email. My email address is emmanuel@utopia.do. I will be glad to work with them. Thank you so much. I hope I did that in less than 2 minutes. This has been good. Thank you for staying. We look forward to continuing this conversation. I don't think it's a one-time conversation. I believe that we're going to have a few more of these kinds of conversations. And I look forward to chatting more with you soon. Thank you once again to all of our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah.